Yes, it's time for The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, and with us is Anne Bagameri of the International Herald Tribune. How are you?
Fine.
Nice to see you. Nice to see Craig Kapitas as well, journalist and author of books, among them Bear Hunting with the Politburo, Vivian Walt of Time Magazine, and Ana Navarro-Pedro of Visão. I always wonder if I'm getting the pronunciation right.
Yeah, she's fine.
He's getting good at it, I think.
Okay.
Very good.
Portuguese is...
Enough of that already. The World This Week, where you can weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and also on Twitter. You can find us at FrancoisF24. And pay attention, because with the big build-up in stories this weekend, at the end of the show, we're going to play Guess Monday's Front Page. We'll start by asking if it's revolution over in Egypt. The head of Egypt's Mubarak-appointed Constitutional Court allowing Lieutenant General Ahmed Shafiq to stand for president and dissolving the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated parliament. Vivian Walt, when you look at the story, the way it's unfolded this week, big build-up this Friday now, we're on the eve of the election, and it's is it revolution over?
I'm not sure about over, but certainly interrupted. However, it's been interrupted for several months, and in a way this was kind of foretold. It was always an unfinished revolution, and it was always very doubtful that the military would really yield real power. And I think this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a power grab by the military that looks like it's afraid to yield too much to the Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood. And certainly it looks like the elections themselves will not be particularly something that will resolve the political situation.
And what's interesting to see is the reactions, for instance, on Twitter, a lot of resignation. Ali Salate from Cairo simply posted this: revolution, to revolve in a circle until you reach the place you started in. Anne Bagameri, do you get a sense that people are just growing weary now?
I haven't been to Egypt in at least 2.5 years before all of this started. I think people were weary before. I think there was a sense that one individual or a group of determined individuals really couldn't make a difference in Egypt, and that's probably what's closing back in now. And I think that's probably the saddest part of all of this. There was optimism that this was the determination of the Egyptian people to choose their own government and decide their own future, and now it turns out that the elections might have been fair. The inspectors all thought that it was a fairly clean process, but what difference does it make whether it was fair or not fair if the Constitutional Court was simply going to impose the will of the military? So if I were in Egypt right now, I'd be thinking, well, that was a waste.
Now, reactions from the main candidates, a little bit difficult to read on the one hand. Mohamed Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, calling it at times in the past 24 hours a full-fledged coup, but at the same time, through the voice of the Speaker of the Assembly, asserting that that the party is ready to return to those polls for cancelled legislative elections. What would you do, Ana Navarro-Pedro, if you were the Muslim Brotherhood? Would you be taking part in this presidential election or not?
You cannot ask me that question. It's just so out of my universe. I've said this before, but mainly here in France, for instance, most really sharp on edge specialists about Egypt always said the Muslim Brotherhood were really the important, they would say dangerous, movement to watch for, because it would be the one getting into power by elections, the only one who had the capacity to do it. And they always said once they would get into power, that would be something like in 1993 in Germany. This is what you could hear, from specialists here in France, mainly off the record in some meetings. And some conferences. I don't know. It's extremely difficult right now. You can be very torn between two positions. One, you want democracy and you want the result of elections and the will of people to go ahead. And secondly, you know that the world is about to collapse into chaos. And this could be one of the points of collapse. So, what do? Are you going to accept that we are on the brink on some military coup or whatever? Are we going to accept another military state in the Middle East and say, okay, they're going to save us in the West? Or are we going to pull the game of democracy and say, let the people choose? And if they choose what we don't like in the West, well, too bad.
Vivian, how do you think the Muslim Brotherhood's handling it?
The Muslim Brotherhood is a very big machine, although not a very united one. I mean, it is exceedingly divided, and there are, major factions within it that never wanted to join the revolution. But I think that the fundamental problem is when you were in Tahrir Square during the revolution, it was great. It was, as all the young Egyptians were saying, this is like Woodstock. And in a way, that was its problem. There was no real powerful leadership that emerged from it. And therefore, 18 months on, you have the existing leadership structures who have the muscle to push through in an election. And you're back to, as the tweet says, you're back to square one.
And as for Hosni Mubarak's last prime minister, well, he's unequivocally pleased.
I promise you a nation for all Egyptians, a new, just and modern nation for all.
Craig Kopidis, does that sound like a guy who already knows the outcome of that presidential election?
You think? The pen may be mightier than the sword, but what this proves is that, an Egyptian armed forces officer with a Kalashnikov in his hand is mightier than Twitter and Facebook. I like that Woodstock comparison. I think it's appropriate. Everyone was spending too much time for the past year and a half looking at the fuzzy, huggy, kumbaya aspect of all these people in the square, and that's legitimate. But there's a word here that hasn't been used. I haven't heard it used much since my days in Cold Warrior days in the Soviet Union. Realpolitik. Remember that word? They spelled no C at the end. You'd put a K, right? No one ever looked at the realpolitik here. The theme that you bring up here, the theme that everyone is discussing about the military, this narrative has been discussed on this program, on other programs, in your newspaper, in Time, and my papers, for the past year and a half. There's no new here. We knew that these military officers were going to allow this to happen, just as we knew those who were at Woodstock knew that peace, love, and brown rice was not going to exist forever.
But it maybe did end the Vietnam War.
Well, there were other reasons besides ending the Vietnam War.
But you talk about realpolitik. Speaking in the company of her South Korean counterpart, the U.S. Secretary of State this Friday, putting Egypt's top brass, the ruling Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, on notice. Remember, the United States, huge provider of military aid to Egypt, regarding both the election and also the ruling earlier in the week that restores broad powers to arrest and detain on the part of those security forces.
Concerned about recent decrees issued by the SCAF. Even if they are temporary, they appear to expand the power of the military to detain civilians and to roll back civil liberties.
Was that as far as Hillary Clinton could go under the circumstances, Anne Baghamuri, or should the U.S. have been more forceful?
Well, I think that'll come next. As you point out, the U.S. is still a large provider of weaponry to Egypt. She hasn't pulled out the money card yet. And never forget, the Americans have decided as a foreign policy that they are going to let the people decide. They're going to encourage former dictatorships to let the people determine their future. If Hillary Clinton came down now and said, all right, that's it, we gave it a shot, but it's just not going to work, and okay, we're going to bring in the Marines, that would be completely out of character for this administration. I think this administration probably has more patience, and it can only afford to have patience at this juncture. It's still fighting an expensive war in Afghanistan, and there's not a lot of money left in the U.S. coffers. They're going to have to try to persuade countries to do the right thing. And that was, I think, the first step.
Hasn't been, by the way, the greatest of weeks for Hillary Clinton. She was disavowed by her own administration. But this on a different topic. Defense Department sources accusing her of spin when she depicted the return of Russian helicopters to Syria as a fresh delivery. Clinton getting it from all sides, with her Russian counterpart blasting that assertion, as well as the one by the State Department spokesperson that Moscow and Washington were, quote, continuing to talk about a post-Assad transition strategy in Syria.
As for assertions that we are holding some sort of talks on the fate of Syria after Bashar al-Assad, I can repeat that this is not true. We don't get involved in overthrowing regimes, neither through approval of unilateral elections by the UN Security Council, nor by participation in any political plots.
You hear Sergei Lavrov there. Does he have a point?
I think he has a very big point. I think what he's pointing to is directly to the confusion that's not only affecting everyone who's trying to deal with Syria, but throughout the region. The icing on this cake of confusion and disconnect is another point, another news item that came out in relation to this about these Russian helicopters that the American government is buying these Russian helicopters. And I heard this and I went, why would the United States government be buying these old and cumbersome Soviet gunships? And it turned out that they're not buying them for themselves, they're buying them for the Afghanis because they're the only kind of helicopters that the Afghanis know how to fly. Now, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, as Mr. Dillon says, and I don't think you need to be an expert in foreign relations to know, to coin a phrase, that this is what's known as a fakaked deal. The left hand isn't talking to the right hand. There is a confluence of confusion and disconnect going on every discussion throughout the Middle East right now, from Egypt to Syria to Afghanistan, wherever you want to look.
Inside the Obama administration.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to Mexico, where Barack Obama will be sitting down with Vladimir Putin at the start of next week. Their first sit down in 3 years. What will Barack Obama get out of Mr. Putin, who's had some very strong words regarding Syria?
Well, I think this is Putin's moment in which to say and act as if, look, I'm not Dmitry Medvedev. I'm not going to be, drawn into some conflict like I was, like my predecessor was in Libya. We haven't mentioned Libya. Libya, I think, overshadows all these discussions about Syria. There will be no military intervention because of Libya. Yeah. And the Russians feel like they were at least suckered. And in some ways they were.
But they have agreed to let those UN military observers come in. There was a sense a couple of weeks ago. Remember we were talking on this show about a Yemen sort of kind of solution where you gently push Assad out. Is that all off the table now?
Seems to me it is. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's much except for, tiny little scraps and pieces of the Annan plan left. But there isn't a day that goes by without, significant numbers of deaths. So I just don't see what there is for us to salvage out of it. I guess it's better than nothing.
On Friday, on that point, the French foreign minister saying that Paris is considering providing communications equipment to Syrian rebels to encourage, quote, a stronger revolt against Assad, pointing to the fact that the Annan plan is not working. Inside Syria, the violence escalating, as Vivian was saying, dramatically. This is amateur footage posted from the internet this Friday from the city of Homs. The difference now, though, inside Syria, as we mentioned it just a moment ago, is the presence of those UN observers, but who are finding it hard to get around.
The escalating violence is now limiting our ability to observe to verify, to report, as well as assist in local dialogue and stability projects.
Anna Navarro Pedro, those UN military observers, what do they bring anything, you think, to?
I don't know if they can, they're not bringing anything to the conflict. I don't know if they can bring reliable information to Western powers. That remains to be seen. I don't know about Putin. I think Putin does have a psychological problem with the West. He's so much stuck now into his displeasure and mistrust of the Western countries and powers that seems to be a really big obstacle in this particular conflict. Secondly, let's not forget that Russia has the only only access point to Mediterranean through Syria, and they've sent troops into that little port of Syrian port this week. They've sent men over there and war material, but apparently for themselves. So I don't know what this means in military terms, but it's interesting to notice that. And thirdly, there is, I believe in the United States, mainly in United States American think tanks, there has been this idea that Iran might start pulling her support for Assad right now, because they are seeing, apparently, this is how the logic goes in Washington think tanks, they are seeing the conflict between Sunnis and Shia going so far through Syria that they don't think it's worth to let it spread any farther by keeping huge support to Assad's regime.
And very briefly,
sorry, just to end it. So these are new things that might put Putin, if he's isolated and not with Iran on the scene, that might change his.
In one sentence, the new Vladimir Putin, it's his second time around as president, an ideologue or a pragmatist when he sits down with Obama?
He's a Russian. Strach, power.
All right. And on that note, we'll leave it there, but we'll be back with part 2 of The World This Week, and we'll show you how a French politician dodges a political bullet. Stay with us.